Today, I wanted to give a public apology for spoiling the ending of a movie that came out this year, which we're going to be talking more about. The movie's name is Together, starring Allison Brie and Dave Franco. A copyright lawsuit was also filed against them, among other parties. And again, we're going to get into that. And it caught my eye, primarily because I find copyright to be a very interesting area. I made a short video getting into the details somewhat of this movie and the copyright lawsuit around it. And I am someone who loves spoiler alerts. I will literally read the plot of a movie before I go and watch it, and it doesn't ruin it for me. And I know that that is not the case for most people. So mea culpa. I'm sorry if I spoiled the film for you, but because of some of the comments I saw on those short reels that I made, I thought it would be interesting to make a more in-depth video getting into the ins and outs of this complaint. I do want to caveat by saying I am not your attorney. This is not legal advice. This is made for entertainment and educational purposes only. If you have a situation or questions about copyright or another IP issue, I highly recommend that you go and find an attorney that you can talk to directly about your situation because every case is different. So let's get into it. The way that I want to do this is I want to break it down by parties, the claim, and then I'll give like a timeline of the actual complaint, just to give like a snapshot of what we're talking about. This year in July, a movie by the name of Together came out. It was distributed by Neon, and it's starring Allison Brie and Dave Franco. They are both husband and wife and coworkers. The movie looks very interesting. I am not a horror person. This is not usually the movie I would go for, but nonetheless, it's a very interesting concept. However, a complaint was filed in May of this year alleging that Together infringed upon the copyrights of a writer by the name of Patrick Fallon, who wrote a script by the name of Better Half. Let's get into the details. The complaint itself was filed in California District Court on May 13th, 2025. The parties involved, we're going to start with the plaintiff. The plaintiff is Studio Fest LLC. This is a New York limited liability company. They produce, finance, and distribute films. They acquired the rights to this film titled Better Half, which was written by Patrick Fallon, and they're the plaintiff, so they filed this complaint because they acquired the copyrights from Patrick. On the other side, we have the defendants, and there's quite a few listed. So first is William Morris Endeavor Entertainment, LLC. This is a California limited liability company. As consumers, we probably recognize them as WME, which is a talent agency, and they manage Franco and Brie and Michael Shanks, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. So next we have Dave Franco and Allison Brie. They're listed as individuals. They are the stars in Together, and they also helped with the production of the movie. Next we have Michael Shanks, also listed as an individual, and he is the writer and director of Together. And then next we have Neon Rated LLC, which is a Delaware limited liability company. Neon acquired Together after its screening at Sundance. I believe they purchased it for $17 million, which was like a record-breaking purchase at Sundance. And so as the distributor, they are also listed in this complaint. And then finally, there are does 1 through 10. What is the claim? Like, what is being alleged here? And this is the part that I really wanted to get into because I noticed some of the comments, and I'm going to read them later at the very end once we get through all of this. I find it interesting, the public perception of copyright versus the legal understanding of copyright. Hopefully I can provide a little bit of clarity on what exactly is copyright infringement. There are two elements that are necessary for the plaintiff to establish in a copyright lawsuit. So first, they have to own a valid copyright. And second, they have to show that the defendant infringed upon the plaintiff's copyright. The first element, that is having a valid copyright. This has to do with ensuring that the creation is original and also that it is in a tangible medium of expression. Registration is not required to have a copyright. You get the copyright upon creating the work. However, if you want to enforce your copyright against other people in court, i.e. litigation, you need to register it with the United States Copyright Office. The second element of showing that the defendant infringed upon the plaintiff's copyright is, of course, the more challenging aspect of this. It can be done via direct evidence. So an example I read earlier was like if someone was distributing a pirated copy of a movie online, you might be able to demonstrate direct evidence via screenshots of the film being sold online or the actual film itself. Like that is the direct infringement that you can tangibly hold in your hands. Sometimes, though, such cut and dry evidence is not always available. And so courts do allow for demonstrating copyright infringement via circumstantial evidence. And the way that this is done is the plaintiff demonstrates that the defendant had access before the derivative work was made, and that the derivative work is substantially similar to the original. Went through the complaint and made a timeline, okay? And so this starts in 2011. Patrick states that he conceived the idea for Better Half. It was written over the next few years. He's developing the idea, and then he writes it into a screenplay in 2019. In that same year, Studio Fest optioned it. So that's when Studio Fest comes into play and acquires the rights. In 2020, the full script for Better Half, so this is Patrick's idea, was provided to WME via email for purposes of pitching to both Franco and Brie to star in. This was done in like industry standards, pitching the idea via email, giving a synopsis. They gave the full script, and they state in the complaint that this was done with the intention of, it being confidential and the script would not be used outside of the ability to pitch to them. The next day, UME writes back to Studio Fest and says that they're going to pass on this offer. That Franco and Brie are not interested in starring in Better Half. So sometime after that happened, and the Better Half premiere at a film festival in 2023, Michael Shanks, according to interviews with him, Brie, and Franco, pitched the idea for Together to Franco and Brie, which they accepted. Development on Together, which is Michael Shanks and Franco and Brie's version of this storyline, development began on that idea in 2024. So again, Better Half premiered at a film festival in 2023. It was registered with the Copyright Office in 2024 ahead of its distribution deal. The screenplay itself was registered in spring of this year, 2025. And it was at the beginning of this year, in January, when Patrick learned of Together and initiated this lawsuit. I also read that upon learning of Together, two of the producers that worked on Better Half went to the screening at Sundance to see, are these movies alike? And in the complaint, they alleged that they were horrified at just how similar the details were. And that's what we're about to go over next. So this would be the dates regarding when the Better Half idea was pitched to WME in 2020 in the hopes that Brie and Franco would star in it. Again, they declined. In January 2025, that's when Patrick learned that Together had been created, and access is fairly straightforward, right? They provided the emails where they pitched the idea to WME, to Franco and Brie, and the response back saying that they weren't going to move forward with it. Next, we get into substantial similarity. The discourse around substantial similarity, especially now with artificial intelligence, is incredibly fascinating. So I, as a nerd, encourage you to look into it more because it's just very interesting. For purposes here, I want to preface the list of, I went through the complaint. I made a summary of all of the similarities that they provide between Together and Better Half. But before we get into that, I do want to start by explaining the idea expression dichotomy in Scenes Affair. If you've seen some of my other videos, we've talked about this before. So you can't copyright an idea. You can copyright an expression of an idea. In this case, an idea, generally speaking, would be a story about a couple who get fused together as a metaphor for codependency. That might be too broad. If that were the only commonality between both movies, that's probably too broad to copyright, right? Because no one person should be able to basically have a monopoly on being able to write a story about couples being fused together as a metaphor for codependency. However, an expression of an idea, which requires unique details, it's taking that idea and actually turning it into plots and characters and sequences of events. And so if you can demonstrate that the characters, the plot, and the sequence of events are uncannily similar and across both of the works, you have an argument for substantial similarity. And Scenes Affair is it's basically what it sounds like. No one can copyright New York as an idea. No one can copyright Central Park as an idea. Think of all the rom-coms that would not have been made if only one person could use Central Park, right? You can't do that. It's too broad. It's an idea in general. However, a very specific romantic comedy script that takes place in Central Park with the characters and the dialogue and the sequence of events would be specific enough to copyright. It's no longer just an idea, it's an expression. Let's get into the meat of what is being compared. We have virtually identical promotional images where the starring couple is looking into the camera with their heads at an angle. When you compare both promotional images, they look the exact same. The only difference is that in one, you have the couple that starred in Better Half, and then in the other, you have Brie and Franco. Next, both movies center around a couple waking up to their bodies fused together. Again, this is a metaphor for codependency. Both feature one of the characters being codependent due to having codependent parents, and the other being commitment phobic due to parental trauma. In both films, the codependent character is a teacher, and the commitment phobic character is an artist. Next, Plato's Symposium is used as a thematic element in each explicitly, so it's mentioned and used as an idea explicitly in both movies. In both, characters attempt to separate themselves, but then accept their fate, and they attempt to separate themselves in both with like similar modes, chainsaws, going to the hospital, so on. Next, both movies end in the same way. Spoiler alert, this is where I piss people off, but both movies end in the same way, with the couple pulling out a vinyl record of the Spice Girls album, Spice World. And this to me is a really critical detail because that is such a specific, unique way of ending a film like this. The fact that they're accepting their fate in the same way, it's the same album, that stood out to me. Of all the things that they went through in comparison, in comparing both, that one stood out to me the most. Next, we have the sequence of events is strikingly similar. Both feature conjoined creatures of some sort in the opening scenes, which is later recalled in both movies in the second act. In both, conjoined rats are found at similar times by the same character. In both, supernatural forces lead to the couples being conjoined in the films. And in the second act of both works, one of the main characters discusses their obsession with Spice Girls and the other discusses their parental trauma. So like some of this is like, again, you would think, oh, that's just like a general idea. No one can copyright supernatural forces leading to something weird, like being conjoined to someone else. But it's the totality of the circumstances, the fact that all these details together, the same sequence of events, the same plots for each characters, the same character development together, that is the expression. And so there's an argument here for these potentially being substantially similar. There's a few more comparisons that are made. There's one scene where the characters become conjoined at their genitals while hiding in a bathroom from a person who has a crush on one of the characters. This happens in both movies. In both, they experience seizure-like movements upon being conjoined, and they discuss, as I said earlier, using a chainsaw to separate. They fight over going to the hospital. And then finally, both works employ cartoonish aesthetics, like think Looney Tunes-esque type of themes and elements in the movies. That was a summary of the whole list. Like it's much more fleshed out in detail in the complaint, but they basically go through and these are their arguments for proving substantial similarity. Again, this was filed in May. And so the next step is the defendants are served and then they have an opportunity to respond. In an article that I found, I was trying to find like the most up-to-date update on what's going on with this case because, again, it was filed in May. It's now August when I'm making this. The last thing I read was that a motion to dismiss was filed by the defendants. So this is basically asking the judge to dismiss this lawsuit. And their argument is that there's no substantial similarity, which, again, I think that's super interesting that that's the reason why they want it to be dismissed. Because substantial similarity is like, that's where the meat of this argument is going to be. I'm very intrigued as to what happens next. From what I've seen so far, that was the last big update procedurally was this motion to dismiss being filed. I haven't been able to read it yet because again, I came across that in an article, but that hasn't reflected in some of the timelines I've seen just from publicly available resources. But besides the procedure of it all, on June 18th, 2025, Michael Shanks did come out with a statement regarding the lawsuit. He's really the only one who's made a public statement so far. This was posted on Neon's accounts, and it states, a statement from Michael Shanks. Have you ever been in a relationship so long that the line between you and the other person starts to blur? I've been with my partner for over 16 years, almost half my life. That entanglement of identity, love, and codependence is what inspired Together. It's not just a script, it's a reflection of something deeply personal. Tim's story, his love for Millie, his relationship to his family, his relationship to unfulfilled ambitions as a musician is completely rooted in my own personal life. I lost my father at a young age in the same way our main character does. His trauma is rooted in my own. To have this called into question is not only deeply unsettling, but entirely untrue. I wish I didn't have to clarify this, but I completed the first draft in 2019 and registered it to the Writers Guild of America that same year. In October 2020, I received development funding from Screen Australia to further the project. In 2022, my agent at WME introduced me to Dave Franco. From our very first meeting, we bonded over our love of horror, and I pitched him Together, a script I had been trying to get into production for years with no luck. Soon after, he and Alison Brie came on board to act in and produce the film. To now be accused of stealing this story, one so deeply based on my own lived experience, one I've developed over the course of several years, is devastating and has taken a heavy toll. That is the first half of this statement, and I will link to the rest of it below. But what I find interesting about what he's saying is one of the defenses that can come up in a copyright infringement suit is proving that this idea was independently created. Sometimes two people completely separated from one another, who have no affiliation with one another, who have never met, come up with ideas that are uncannily similar. It happened. Michael Shanks can demonstrate that he independently created this. He could, that could be a defense to this whole suit. I said I was going to read some of the comments that I received when I did an update on this. Let's read some of those. So some of the comments that came up on this whenever I first made a reel about it. So at DMI33 said the better half writer pitched the idea to Franco and Brie, so this isn't a case of you can't copyright a general idea like couples choosing together. There is proof that they took the original idea from someone. Now, this person's getting to access. Like, there is proof that there was access, but you have to remember there's two elements. Like, you can't just say someone had access to my idea, therefore boom, copyright infringement. You also have to show substantial similarity. In the eyes of the public, you may disagree with that. You may think they had access, like you may be a firm believer that they stole the idea and you are entitled to that opinion. But in the eyes of the law, you have to show access and substantial similarity. Next, at Lucy Gutierrez 2968 commented, the producers who made Together said they have notes and scripts that prove they had been working on this since 2019 before the movie Better Half. And that's going to go to defenses for independent creation, right? If they can demonstrate and they have a paper trail that this was an independently created idea and it's just a coincidence that it is so similar to Better Half, then they could potentially defend themselves in this lawsuit. And then people rightfully railed on me for giving the spoiler alert after the spoiler. I'm so sorry. At Joey Clemenza 7339 commented, so in both movies, they end with when two become one playing in the background. That's both disturbing and a bit on the nose. One would even think that the writer of the first movie had a sick imagination and used that song to write that first script. Here's the thing though, Michael Shanks registered his script in 2019 with the WGA. Franco wasn't pitched Better Half until the very next year when he declined. That should be enough proof to throw this case out. All we can do is wait and see. I would love to know what your thoughts are on this, what you think about the claims here over substantial similarity, or maybe you have thoughts over the independent creation defense and proving access to these ideas. So share with me in the comments below. And if you like this content, please subscribe. I will be following this case closely so you can expect an update as soon as an update happens. Thanks for watching.